Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is a video on React hooks. I'm going to go over all sort of the basic sort of most used React hooks. Again, React hooks just add more functionality to function components. So it just allows you to do all the cool stuff you typically historically only do in class components, but in function components in oftentimes very nice syntax. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start up this project. Right now it's just an empty app component. So again, just to kind of, now if you want a template like the one that I am using, what you can do is you can just type in this command, mpx merced reactor, the name of your project. So you'll say whatever, like hooks, and then JS. Because there's also a TypeScript template, so you would just add TS instead of JS. But you do that command, oh, actually not npm, make it mpx, so that's a one-time usage, and then that'll generate the project for you. So this command would do that if you want to be using sort of the same setup that I'm using. Cool. So let me actually get this server run, npm run dev. And essentially there's several different types of hooks. And as you can see, again, this is a functional component. So notice that this app component is defined as a function, not as a class. So all the JSX is whatever is returned by the function. So the first thing I want to do is define how do we do state. Because in a class component, you would do the constructor, and then in the constructor you would define state, and you had this one state object that you could update. You could still follow that sort of, one state object model. Then the way you would create state is you just do this. It uses a well, let's just break it down step by step. What happens is there's a function called react.useState. All hooks always start with this prefix use. That's how you know it's a hook. And then here in this function, you'd pass in what the initial state is. So say initial state has the value of hello, and that's going to have, oh, there we go, our server's starting up. So just give it a second for that to start up. It's starting. Hello world, okay. So hello world. So again, this is sort of like a class component where you're putting everything inside one object. Hello world, cheese, Gouda. Now the problem is, right now I'm just running this function, I'm not saving the state anywhere, so I need to save it in a variable. And this function doesn't just return the state, it returns an array. It returns an array with the state and the setState function. So what I need to do is I need to deconstruct the return value. So I'm going to do const, and then I make an array, and then the first name I pass in is going to be whatever I call the state variable. So for now we'll keep it simple, we'll call it state. And then the second is your setState function, so I'll call that setState. Okay, and there you go. There I have created my state, and it works just like using state in this setup. It pretty much works just like it is in a class component. I would just access the properties by doing like state.hello, state.cheese, and that's one of the nice things about function components. You don't have to worry about the word this. So there's no this.state.that, this.blah blah blah. You can just do state. Cool. So that's how you would trigger state. So create state with the useState hook. And it works just like state. So now what I can do here is, instead of using hello world hard coded there, I can now do state.hello. And then state.cheese. Okay, save. And see, now it says hello world Gouda, because those are the variables in state. And again, the big benefit of state is that when it changes, it causes the component to re-render. That's why state matters. If otherwise, you would just save everything like normal variables. So let me create a button just to illustrate this. Okay, click me. And I'm going to pass this button a function on click. And that's another nice thing about function components. I don't have to worry about binding my event handlers. It just works. So I'm just going to pass it an arrow function. And this arrow function is just going to be real simple. It's just going to set state Now, the thing is that if I keep all the state in one object, like here, it's not going to be like a class component where it automatically like reconciles the stuff you pass in with the stuff that used to be there. You have to reconstruct it. So basically, I'd have to do something like this. If I only want to change cheese, what I would do is first, I would spread the existing state, so that way I capture all the properties, and then I would redo, let's say, the cheese property and make that American. Okay, so that's what I did there. I said, okay, give me the existing state, but change this property. And you could do that, and then keep it everything inside one tidy object, but you don't have to. That's the beauty of function components. But right now I'm showing it to you, so that way, if you're used to sort of having one state object, how would you sort of pull that off? So now we have this button, and if I click this button, see, it updates the state. And notice, nowhere in my code do I say, hey, go re-render, like, you know, make these DOM changes. Or I'm not saying, like, create this element, append this element. It just knows that when this setState function is run, that it should rebuild this component and its JSX with the new data. So it just gets re-rendered with the new data. The cool thing is I can create many pieces of state. Okay, so I can create other state, like I can create, let's say I want to have certain settings for my entire app. I can just say settings, set settings, and then I can just be like useState, and then pass in the object, and we'll say like color blue, and we'll use that later. Okay, and again, it's react.useState. You could destructure it from the React object, but I'm going to keep it simple. Okay, so that's how that works. Okay, that's the useState hook. So you can create as many pieces of state in your functional components as you want as separate variables. And again, you just use the syntax. This first being your variable, second one being your set function. Okay, the next hook is useEffect. Basically what happens is you may have certain things that you don't want happening every time. Okay, so for example, let's say I wanted to do, we'll keep it simple, let's say I wanted to do like a console log, and I want the console log the first time, and I only want this to happen the very first time the component loads. But here's the problem: if I put that console log there, it happens every time this component gets re-rendered. So now if I keep clicking, I click the, so let's actually bring up the console first. So see, that console log happened the first time. It happened when the component loaded, but now when I click here, the component got rebuilt itself, so it ran that console log again. And if I click it again, it'll do it again and again and again and again and again. Okay, I may not want to happen, especially with like API calls or with certain state updates, because if the state updates and then the code that updated the state runs again, you end up creating this like infinite loop between state updates and the thing that changes the state. So if I only want things to happen in certain situations, that's where the useEffect hook comes into play. Okay, and it's just react dot useEffect. And the way this works is you pass in a function. Okay. And I can do console.log the first time. And then what you do is that function will always fire the first time the component loads, period. But if I wanted to run again, I can pass it an array as a second argument. You always pass in the array as a second argument. Now, if you only want it to happen once, just leave the array empty. Okay, cool. So it happens when the array is empty. So that means it'll only happen the first time. So see, the first time, but then if I click the button, see, it doesn't happen again. So it's only one console log. So that's cool. That's great for like API calls. So you have some sort of data you need to grab right when the component loads. You grab it, you stuff it in state, and you don't have to worry about creating an infinite loop. But let's say I do want it to update when specifically state.cheese updates. I could put state.cheese in the array, or a prop, or anything like that. Okay. Now, again, it ran the first time, and then if I click it, it happened the second time. But see, it doesn't happen again. Because even though technically I'm setting the state and I'm re-rendering the component every time I click this button, the actual value of the state hasn't changed. So those dependencies, it's not that an assignment has occurred, it has to be a different value. So when the actual value of these dependencies change, that's what will trigger this function to rerun. Okay, this function that you pass in here. Okay, so that's how useEffect works. It's a good way to kind of trigger things that only happen in certain situations, not every situation. And one last piece of React.useEffect, sometimes a component goes away, it leaves the screen, it dismounts. So if you want something to happen when it dismounts, you would do something like this. You would just return another function. So in the function, you return another function, and this function runs when that component disappears. Because you might have had some setup, like you've created some DOM elements, or you've done some stuff that you need to clean up when that component leaves, or some event listeners you created, and those event listeners aren't needed anymore when that component's gone, so you need to go back and remove them. So you would do that here in this function that's returned by the useEffect function. So that's a thing, just so you're aware you can do that. Okay. So that's the useEffect function. So again, to create events that don't occur every render of the component, use the useEffect hook. Cool. So that's the useEffect hook. Okay, now we're gonna let's talk about another issue that comes up. Okay, and this is the issue of what's called prop drilling. So let's imagine this. Let's create some simple components. Okay, so let's pretend that there's a component, we'll just call it second level. So const second level. Equals props. And all this does is return another component called third level. And then third level. Okay, and see, I have to define, so since I'm doing them in the same file, I have to define them in reverse order. Because since if this is going to render second level has to be defined before it, and if this is going to render third level has to be defined before it. So this, so you understand why I'm writing it this way. Props, and all this component does is render, is going to render a prop. So we'll just say h1, and the props dot, we'll call it hello. Cool. So now where is this going to get that props from? From the component that rendered it. Who rendered it? Second level. Second level rendered it, so it has to pass in that prop. So we have to say hello. Okay. But, well, so we have to define what this hello property is. And we're going to say that this passes down its own props. So it's going to pass in its own props again, called hello. Okay. So then who's going to pass down this hello to second level? Well, that's going to have to be done by app. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase, I'll just leave all that there. I'm going to put second level here. And then we have to define what we pass in as hello here. So here we're going to pass in the state.hello. Okay, so essentially what's happening is that this, my app, let's see why it's, what does, oh no, I didn't close the component. It froze. Okay, I'll give it a second to restart. But essentially, what's happening is that, I know that was going to happen. Okay, let me just close that, save. So this basic app renders second level and passes its state, hello, as this hello prop. Second level receives the hello prop and renders third level and passes that same prop down as a prop down to third level and props a hello. So this is how you do it. If you have a lot of nested components where one component's inside of another component, but they need data from the very top component, you have to do this. This is what's referred to as prop drilling, where you're passing a prop to another component, who passes it to another component. And this gets really annoying, because what if you change something? Now you got to change it at each level. So this was like the most annoying thing in the world for a very long time. So this is where people got into like state management libraries such as MobX and Redux, because they wanted to kind of avoid this whole prop drilling where they had to pass props down several levels. So eventually React added a hook to deal with this called context. And what context does, it acts like an elevator for data. So that way the elevator, when you go to an elevator, you don't have to stop at the second, third, and fourth, fifth floor to get to the seventh floor. Okay, the elevator can go directly from the first floor to whatever floor you specify, and that's what this is going to do. Okay, so let's do this. So to do this, we need to actually create a context object, which doesn't get defined inside of a component. So I'll just go over here to the top of my file and create that context. So we'll say const, and usually you name it whatever it is, then with the word context in it. So in this case, we're going to pretend it's those settings. Remember those settings that we said we're going to create a state that's settings for the applications. So we're going to say settings context. And settings context equals a new context object. So that's going to be react.create context. Okay. And okay, and right now it's just going to be null for the moment. Well, actually, let me think about how I want to do that. Okay, just to give you a simpler, more cleaner example, we have the settings context over here. So what I'm going to do is this whole settings object color blue. We will move. We'll just create a new object here. And we'll say the settings context has things like color, or we'll say big different color schemes. So dark, there's a dark color scheme. Inside the dark color scheme is like background color black, foreground color white, and then also in here is a light color scheme which is another object where the background color is white and the foreground color is black. Okay, now I save that. Okay, so this creates this context object. Okay, this context object, it's basically data that I can pass around like an elevator. Okay, that's what's happening here. So now if I want to use this, first thing I have to do is wrap my component in the context. So basically my app component, let's go to my app component, which is right here, so app. So go to my JSX, and then what I have to do is use a component that's built in when I create my context. So in this case, we're going to have settings context dot provider. And this provides the information. This basically creates the entry of the elevator. Okay. Control X. Okay. This creates the entry of the elevator. Okay, so there we go. And we'll say right now we want our context to just provide the dark theme. Okay, let's see here, value equals okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to just send down. Actually, let me refactor this just a little bit. I'm going to get rid of. I'll leave that as it is up there. This doesn't. Let me just do it this way. Just wanted to be a little bit more clear. So we'll do const theme equals this object. So same story, except now what I can do is I can say initially I want create context to be theme.light. So initially this context is theme.light. But even though that's the case, I can change what this settings context is. So when I create the provider that wraps around my component, I can just change what it is and say, hey, now it's value theme.dark. Or whatever data I want to pass down. Okay, so I'm saying, hey, now the dark theme is what the context is. Okay, so basically this settings context provider is now providing the dark theme to any component in this chain and any of its children. So if I want to get that information to third level, I don't have to pass it as a prop to second level. Okay, I don't have to do what I did with hello. What I can do now is that in this component, so let's go back to third level. Let's just break this down into a full function now. So we're going to have to return that h1. Now what I can do, that should be in the same line. But now what I can do is that from third level, I just do this. I'll say const theme equals react.useContext settings context. So what it does is that in this component, it says, hey, I want you to pull the data from the settings context. So then it starts looking at its parent component. I don't see a provider there. So then it goes to the parent component of that component and looks for the first provider it finds that matches the name. So here's a settings context provider, and it's providing me this theme dark value. So that value gets passed all the way down, and now I don't have to pass it as props. So I can go from like the first level to the 7th level down in components without having to pass a prop each time, which is nice. So now let's just show you that that worked. Okay, let's go past props hello, and then I'll just to show you the deal, we'll just say theme.bg, which should be, if it's a dark theme, it should be black. Okay, we'll just print out the text. Okay, so that just got cleaned up a little bit, and now technically hello world black. That data got passed all the way down without having to pass it through several layers. Okay, so that's how the useContext component works, or the useContext hook. So first you got to create the context, which exists outside of, and you don't even have to pass it data here. I'm pretty sure that if we just did this, it would still work. I can just be like, nah, it's nothing to initialize it as nothing. Let's just see if that breaks. No, yeah, because what matters at the end of the day, this just creates this line here just creates the context, and then it's when you create the provider component that you actually can specify what the value of that is. So I could pass in whatever I want there. So I could have just passed in this settings state here. Okay, so that's one way to pass state down in an elevator to your other components. Okay, so next one is useReducer. This one's actually a lot of fun. This is actually pretty much Redux built into React for the most part. And again, basically, between this and context, you end up having pretty much Redux. Because the useReducer hook is going to allow you to manage your state the way Redux does, and then context is going to allow you to move it up and down your component tree like an elevator to avoid the prop drilling. So let's do a useReducer hook. Okay. This one's going to take a second to explain. But why would you want to use the reducer hook if you have some sort of complex piece of state that isn't so much, oh, I'm just going to change the value. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, so the way I would do is first you want to define like a reducer function. So we're going to do const reducer. So we're doing this in our app component. App useReducer. Okay. Const useReducer. And this useReducer. No. Put that. Const reducer. useReducer is the hook. And what this reducer function always takes in, okay, the current state that was defined by the initial reducer hook, and then action, which is literally whatever you want. Okay. And then what it does is you have a function, And anything you want can happen in the function. So whatever you want to do happens in the function. And what the function returns at the end becomes the new state. Okay? So usually you see this is they'll create a switch. So we'll say switch, which is going to be the action. And then based on what the action is specified, it'll depend what it does. So we'll do something like, so we'll say add case add. Okay. And in that case, what it does, it just takes, it's just going to say result equals the current state plus 1. Then, well, let's put a break there. Then case sub, because I don't want to type too much, is result, and this should be, I'll have a const in front of it. Const state. Oh, this needs an arrow. That's why it's complaining. There we go. Const result, and why is it complaining about that? Cannot redeclare block scope variable result. Yeah, but it's not. Okay. Const result equals state minus 1. Okay, and then we do a break. And then after that, oh, well, that's going to be block scoped. So here's what I need to do. I need to declare the result beforehand, because if not, result won't exist outside of this switch statement. So we'll just say let result here. And then over here we'll return the result. So essentially what happens is the state comes in, and based on whether we pass in the action of add or sub, it'll do a thing, and then update that state. Save. So that's our reducer. So our reducer is this function that allows us to have a little bit more dynamic, what do we do with the state? Cool. We have to actually create this thing though. Okay. So the way it works is kind of like creating a new piece of state. First we pass in the state, so we'll just say, I'll call this our state because it's for our reducer, just so distinguish it from the state we already created. And then you pass in the reducer, which you'll get a function back called dispatch. That's when you use the reducer. So it's basically our state and then our dispatch function, and that's going to equal react.useReducer. And we're going to pass in, okay, the reducer, which we have, reducer, and the initial state, which will just be 0. Okay, so basically this variable our state is going to start out at 0, and then whenever we want to update it, we would just run this dispatch function, and then in this dispatch function we would just pass in the action. Okay, and it would do whatever we wanted to do based on that. Okay, so let me create another button. Well, first things first. Now let's do this. Just to kind of show you how all this kind of fits together. So I have this state here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this state, this our state, down here. So our state, pass that down to the context provider. So that way that is available to our third level component. So I'm going to just change this into theme, because technically that context is being saved in the variable theme, but it's just going to be a number now, so theme. So if I save this, I should get 0. So let's just make sure it says 0. So that should become hello world 0. Good. So that works. So now we're going to make it where you can see how the dispatch button works, or how dispatch works. So let's create 2 more buttons. So I'm just going to copy this button here. Okay, so the only difference is that the click function here, instead of a set state function, because we're not using that particular piece of state anymore, now we're going to use dispatch. Okay. And in dispatch, you should just be passing in the action. Okay, so in this case, I'm expecting just to pass in a string. A lot of people pass in an object, and then the object will have all sorts of properties that you use in your reducer. I'm keeping this one pretty simple. So we're just going to say add, dispatch add. So this button will be called add one. And then we'll just copy this button again. And then this one will be sub as our action. So notice I'm not specifying what the new value of the state is. That's the big difference between using a reducer versus using a set state function. Set state, you're just saying, hey, the state's now this. Here I'm saying, tell this function this is what happened, and then let the function determine what the new state value is. Okay, so now when I click this button, it's going to send add to our reducer, because that's what dispatch does. It takes this, passes it into our our current state, and the action into the reducer function. So when it sees that it's add, it'll run this piece. It'll take the state, add one to it, and then return that, and that becomes the new state. Whatever gets returned is the new state, and that's particularly this rState variable here. Okay, save. So now if I add one, there we go. Just take a second. See, add one. I didn't change the word, but this one should be subtract. And see, it works. Nowhere did I say that the state is now this number. I just put all that logic in my reducer. So this could be useful for anything where you have like multiple possibilities, where you're not sending it to a set value, but there's a lot of different potential ways you manipulate that piece of state. And then you can pass that function up and down. And notice what I did is I took that data, even though all the manipulation of that data occurs in the app component, it gets displayed in the third level component. And how did I get it down there? Using the useContext hook. So I didn't have to pass it through the second level component, okay? Because I use context, and I'm able to do this kind of complex manipulation of the data because I'm using the useReducer hook, which allows me to kind of create these sort of complex possibilities. I can just put all my state logic in that one function, and then just pass in the action and let that determine what happens next. So that one more hook, and then we're done. Okay, and that's going to be the useRef hook. This can be fun with forms. Another way to kind of grab a form's value. So let's say I create const input equals react.useRef null. Okay, that just creates a ref variable. So our ref variable is called input. So now what I'm going to do is I am going to create a input. So I will do that before the buttons. Okay. Button. I'll say input. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say it has a ref property. So this input has a ref property called input. So what happens is that technically that HTML element of the input gets sort of type equals text, gets stored in that ref, and it's almost like if I'm referring to the actual DOM element. Okay, so basically I can actually refer to the input element kind of in the same way I would normally refer to DOM elements using this ref variable, which can be really useful in certain situations. I'll just show you the simplest way it's useful. So let's say I just want to take whatever is entered in that input, and whenever we click on this button, we're setting our cheese to whatever that is. I can just do this. Input, because input is the ref variable. Then it's .current, which means whatever the input is currently referring to. Dot value. I'm pretty sure it is. There we go. So that would take the input's value, because this reference variable is referring to that input, and it'll just take and that's what the current is. And so now if I just go over here, let's wait for that input to show up. There it goes. So let's say I want to change the cheese to Munster. I type in Munster, click me, and it changes to Munster. I say I want to change it to Swiss. I click me, and it changes it to Swiss. Because basically all this is doing is changing it to whatever this form is. So it's just another cool way to grab form values. There's a lot more you can do with it. Like here, let me just console log the input. So let's see here, console.log the input, so you can see like how much stuff is inside this ref. So yeah, no, console logs before it exists. So let me do it somewhere else, because technically this line runs before the actual reference gets connected inside the JSX. So let me actually add it to here. Why not? Console.log input, so we can see what that reference contains. So now if I click the button, so I'll just put some gibberish, click it, changes to that, and here it is. So this is what you end up getting in there. So there's a current, which is the input selected, but you don't just get the value, you get all the normal DOM properties. So you can actually have all sorts of fun with this. You get the access to the children, the child nodes, all the event listeners, all this stuff. So this is a fun way to kind of like be able to dig into, especially if you're using like third-party libraries. The useRef hook is a good way to dig into and manipulate what's going on inside the components that other people gave you to use. Since you can't manipulate what's the original source code, you can go in there and access some of those sub-elements using this. So this is pretty useful in certain situations. One example where I had to use it was, I think it was for like a Stripe thing. I needed to like to get some information out of this component that's created by Stripe, but to get to the form components and grab those values, I needed to first put this ref on the parent component and then dig deeper. So using all this data here. So this is a pretty powerful hook that gives you access to a lot of ways to manipulate your components and other people's components. But yeah, so that's I think a pretty good whirlwind lesson on hooks. So you learned again the useState hook, which allows you to create state and set the state with a function you set its direct value, which triggers a re-render. You learned about useEffect hook, which allows you to create effects, things that happen not on every re-render. You learned about the useContext hook, which allows you to pass data up and down your component tree, kind of like an elevator, making it easier to move data around. You have your useReducer hook, which instead of directly setting the state, what you do is you update your state through a reducer function that updates it based on an action you passed in, and still, again, re-renders the component when the state changes. And then the useRef hook, which allows you to name an HTML element or a component and give it this ref variable, which you can use to kind of look into the guts and manipulate that thing or just grab information from it. So have a great day. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.